Hi everyone, and welcome to week 3 of the course. For this week, you had two excerpts from Charles Koselleck to read, one from a textbook and another from an article that he wrote. So in this, Koselleck lays out a taxonomy of levels of design. So he includes 4 levels: intra, inter, extra, and supratextual. As we go throughout the course, you should use these terms as you evaluate different documents. When you start to work in the tech comm field, you may realize that a lot of companies already have similar standards to this set up in what they call a style guide. Or if you join a newer company as a tech writer or possibly a UX designer, you may have some responsibility for helping to come up with a style guide for the company to use. Now, I want to make sure that we go through and understand what each one of these items is. So, what are we really talking about when we say intratextual? What we're talking about is the low-level adjustments that you can make to text, such as bolding or highlighting, italics, or maybe changing the font size. We're doing these things so we can catch the attention of the reader. So think of something like a textbook that maybe has keywords. You might be bolding those words so it stands out to the students. Next, we have intertextual. Here we use cues to direct users to hierarchies. So in that case, we're talking about headings, indentation, and even lists. It helps the reader determine relationships between the different text that's on the page. For example, if we think about a block of text, we may indicate that that block of text is a paragraph based on either indentation or maybe just including extra space before or after the paragraph. It's things like that that let the reader know that that text belongs together in a paragraph. So I want to take a moment and draw your attention to the list that Koselleck shows in the article, and those are on pages 193 and 194. So here Koselleck talks about the two similar lists. Both have different intertextual elements, but we want to look at why they do. Koselleck is using these examples to show how different intertextual elements can impact visual language, and how that visual language impacts the rhetoric of the message. So look at the list on page 193. We want to first explore why this visual presentation works. We can see that there are two rhetorical strategies here. So the first one is the pattern with the text within the bulleted list. So that heightens the textual elements. Second, we see that each of the items in the list is parallel to the next. So that indicates usually an equal value. So this type of pattern is going to let the reader know that everything in this list is equally important. In this case, it's steps. So the user would know that they have to complete the steps that are in this list equally. Now going on to page 194, if we just glance at this, we might think that, oh, it's a similar bulleted list like the one that we just saw, but it's actually very different once we read the content of the list. So here we see what is essentially a negative message being delivered in a similar bulleted list. So in this case, the visual heightening isn't really the appropriate rhetorical strategy. A bulleted list of reasons like this could be considered embarrassing. I think Koselleck uses the term humiliating even. Information like this is usually better presented as a block of text, and that's so that the reader encounters the text rather than seeing it at first glance. You could even think of this as a more extreme example. Imagine if the author had bolded, "cannot award the contract." That would again be something that is an inappropriate rhetorical strategy. Next, we have the extra textual level. Extra refers to those non-text items that are in a document, so think of images or photographs. And at the textual level, we're specifically talking about elements like callouts or maybe labels. We're going to talk about the extra level in a future slide. And then finally, we have the supra level. So the supratextual level is the document level. So these are the elements that are going to bind your document together. So, for example, at this level, we're talking about things like having a page number at the top or bottom of a page, or doing something like using initial letters for the start of a chapter. And you can see a few other examples in the article that Kosnick discusses. Kosnick also defines 3 coding modes. So those are textual, spatial, and graphic. These modes are essentially materials, so for the textual mode, we're talking about words. In the spatial mode, you make decisions about how the words are set up on the page. And then in the graphic mode, we're talking about things like shading, line weights, even as far as the color of the page. So now that we have these 4 levels of design and we have our 3 coding modes, Kosnick puts together what he calls a visual language matrix, and that can be used in document analysis. So each of the 4 levels can occur in these 3 coding modes. When you think about the intro level at the textual mode, you think about what font you want to use and whether you want to use bold. Then we move to the spatial level and we think about things like the spacing that's between the letters. In typography, we're going to refer to that as kerning. If you're a little bit newer to typography, you might be picking up a few more vocabulary words along the course of these articles. Now, going to the intergraphic level, we could be talking about punctuation marks, or possibly if you have a list, are you using a colon or a dash to lead into that list? And this level can also include other elements such as strike-throughs or underlines. Now I want to go to an example of a technical document. So this document that I have on the screen now is a user manual that was in PDF form for an Instapot. So if you pause here for a moment, and I want you to see what sort of analysis you can come up with before moving on. Now that you've had time to look at the document on your own, let's go over some possible answers that you might have. We already talked a lot about the intra level, so I'd like to start at the intertextual level. So on this document page, we see at the intertextual level headings for the different sections. You can see those with bold, where I'm pointing out with my mouse now. And at the interspatial level, we might be looking at leading, or I'm sorry, leading. If you're newer to typography, the term leading might be newer to you. A good way to actually remember it's pronounced leading and not leading is that they actually used to use at the printers lead to force the space in between the lines that you're seeing. So what leading is an easier way to think about it is probably single spacing or double spacing. So for our leading in this document, you can see that it's most likely single spaced. Some other options are if they do 1.5, any sort of spacing that's in between those lines.